You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down. That's a famous line from the classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. In the film, the protagonist, George Bailey, promises to give his sweetheart the moon. It's a beautiful, romantic idea, but in all the time that humans have gazed up at the moon, only one person has come close to making that promise a reality. Thad Roberts was a NASA co-op with the dreams of becoming the first person to walk on Mars. To chase that dream, Thad pushed himself beyond limits he didn't even know existed, mentally, academically, and socially. He constantly reinvented himself, trying to meet the expectation he believed others had of him. His passion for exploration made him a rising star at NASA, but it also was the very thing that compromised his future. Thad's talents opened doors at one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, and those same talents helped him pull off one of the greatest heists in history. That relentless drive to prove himself also led to a passionate love affair, an affair that took him quite literally to the moon for one unforgettable night. I'm Edwin Romero. This is the Out of Office Chat, and today we're chatting about sex on the moon. All right, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It's been a couple of months since we last chatted, and as I mentioned in my last episode, we have a new family member. So bear with me as I find a new rhythm and flow for these episode releases. As hinted in the cold open, I'll be diving into Sex on the Moon, the amazing story behind the most audacious heist in history, a book by Ben Mezrich. Now, don't let the title fool you. We're going to keep this episode PG, fun for the whole family. I found this book during a trip to the library. I was looking for something to sink my teeth into, and then I read the titillating title and thought to myself, let's take a look. Why not? And honestly, I thought it was going to be about a couple of astronauts kind of, but it wasn't that at all. I was pleasantly surprised about the topic of the book. I've linked it in the show notes below. Before we jump into it, please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast, help the podcast grow. And with that, let's get into it. In the winter of 1996, Thad Roberts finds himself in a very awkward, tense car ride home from the airport with his very devout Mormon parents. They had just discovered that Thad was expelled from the Mission Training Center program. So I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with the Church of Mormonism. I believe young men, they go through this program where they are brought up in the ways of the church to fulfill the work of the church. I'm sure folks in some big cities have seen the young men in their bicycles, white shirts, black ties, just riding around. They go on and do the work of the church. So in this car ride, the parents are severely disappointed. They had just found out that Thad had been hiding a 3-year-long relationship with a gal named Sonia. Now, the secret relationship started when Thad was in high school. Sonia was a red-headed, popular girl. Thad was very shy, very nerdy, and they were quite the odd couple. Now, Thad recalls that they actually had their first intimate encounter in Sonia's car. Now, with this encounter, Thad felt an enormous amount of guilt due to what he understood about the teachings of the Mormon Church. During mission training, Thad was grouped with several other boys in a dormitory, and one night, really late, he was just up contemplating how much guilt, how bad he felt based on his sinful actions, until one boy shouted out, "Hey guys, listen, I have something to confess." And he shared that, well, he had sexual relations with a woman. And after that, another boy said, "Me too." And another said, "Yeah, me too." So, they all had this kind of commonality where they all did something sinful. And so that made Thad feel a lot better, more confident that he wasn't such a bad person. He was so confident that he went to the Mormon president or the mission president and confessed to having sex with Sonia. He was expecting some sympathy, but instead, what the president said was like, "Sinner, you are unworthy of God," and banned him from the training center. Now he finds himself in the car ride home with his parents. It was extraordinarily silent. He was a little bit nervous. I think at one point he thought that his dad was going to take him out in the backyard and actually shoot him with a shotgun. But They took him down to the basement, and his father was like, "You are excommunicado. No communication with your siblings at all. No eye contact, no phone calls, nothing for 2 months." So the reason why they did that was because his parents believed that if Thad had engaged in some sinful behavior, that they too were at risk of going to hell. So 2 months later, Thad packed up his bags. He's like, "See ya, I'm done with this," and married Sonia. Now, after we had married Sonia, he thought to himself, "Man, you know what? I gotta get my life together. I have a wife now. I need to provide for her. I need to focus on a career." So he was attending University of Utah, searching for a possible career. And he was skimming through various career pamphlets when he saw astronaut in one of those pamphlets. He began to read about it, and it turns out that a career as an astronaut is twofold. You can be a pilot, or you can be a mission specialist. The pilots are more reserved for those that have an army or military background, whereas the mission specialists, they can study in a specific area. Mission specialists get their hands dirty, they conduct experiments, and mission specialists land on the moon. He didn't want to be waiting in the shuttle like a pilot does, so he decided, I want to be a mission specialist. But that, he began to think even bigger. He wanted to go to space, but more than that, he wanted to be the first man on Mars. Looking a little bit deeper, he discovered that there is a co-op program at NASA called the NASA's Johnson Space Center Cooperative Program, the JSC. A co-op in this context basically means partial employment by NASA. It's a pretty big deal, and it's extraordinarily competitive. Co-ops would spend 3 tours at the Space Center in Houston, and they would work on projects that are directly related to the space program. Lastly, most co-ops go on to work for the Space Center, and the notable co-ops get to enter the actual astronaut training program. So Thad thought, yes, this is it. This is my thing. This is what I want to do. But to be considered for a co-op, he'd have to step up his game. So he had to go back to school. He studied and majored in physics, geology, and anthropology. Some pretty cool notes about what he accomplished here. In addition to the triple major, he founded the Utah Astronomical Society and the college's observatory, which I think at that time it was basically dead. He revived it. He learned Russian and Japanese, and he completed a charity bike ride and raised $10,000 with Sonia. Overachiever. The co-op program manager, Bob Musgrove, was like, right away, you're in. Yeah, this is exactly what we need in the NASA program, the co-op program. So what happens on the first day? Thad was supposed to go to the Johnson Space Center, the JSC, but incorrectly entered the Space Center Houston, which is the visitor center. Ridiculous! But in all fairness, the Johnson Space Center, the JSC, consists of 100 buildings spread across 1,620 acres. And for comparison, one football field is 1.2 acres. Innocent mistake. As he enters building number 2, the co-op students are already gathered for an orientation lecture. As the orientation is underway, there is an astronaut that begins to elaborate on the evolution of the NASA program. And Thad describes this astronaut as this guy, he has some cowboy swagger, like something like a little edgy about him, something really cool. As the orientation continues, Thad begins to learn a little bit more about the program itself. So y'all who aren't familiar with the NASA program, initially it was focused on sending astronauts into low orbit through the Mercury program. And then it evolved into sustaining human life in space, which was the Gemini program, like really early space programs, right? And then entered the Apollo era. Now, this is the most famous of all the space programs that have taken place. It resulted in 11 manned flights to the moon between 1968 and 1972, with the most famous being Apollo 11's moon landing, which had occurred in 1969. So throughout the lecture, Thad and the co-ops were just in awe of all of NASA's incredible achievements. And as the lecture and orientation were wrapping up, Bob Musgrove ended with, if you're lucky, one day you might be here telling us how it is to walk on Mars. Boom. Everyone just roared in applause, including Thad. But in his head, it's like, got it. I'm going to be the first person on Mars. After the lecture, Thad was assigned to work in the Astro Materials Lab in Building 31. Thad had been one of the only few individuals with an interdisciplinary background, so he was chosen to go work in the Life Sciences Department. With it, he was granted access to several labs across the NASA grounds. When he arrived at the lab, he noticed that there was a man in a white lab, blue scrubs, and surgical mask. He was handling something a little bit odd. It was a rectangular object, kind of like a window, but incredibly thin. It wasn't necessarily transparent, but it wasn't also cloudy or foggy. Then the man, Brian Helms, was another co-op. He explained that he was working with aerogel, like the lowest density solid ever invented, strong enough to hold 1,000 times its weight, but delicate enough to be easily shattered. Now, I've heard about the aerogel. It's pretty cool. Look it up. It's pretty neat. It looks like a cloud, just in a rectangular form. Brian was on his second tour. I know they have like kids who were raised in army families, like army brats. This guy was, I think, the equivalent of a NASA brat. His mom was an engineer and did a lot of contract work with NASA. Brian explained that they're going to be working with a lot of astro materials. They'll be practicing and experimenting on new preparation techniques, kind of getting samples ready. But he also shared, because they're looking beyond the moon, looking at Mars, they're going to be handling meteorites. Curious, Thad asked if there were any moon rocks in the lab. Brian replied with absolutely not. The thing about moon rocks is they're incredibly valuable. They're kept in pristine conditions in the lunar lab, where you have to wear full bodysuits and pass through air purification chambers just to touch one. Thad finds himself at a pool party. Apparently it's a ritual and it happens every couple of weeks. It's quite the rager. There were at least 30 folks. People were drinking. The weird thing is that Thad was struggling with kind of a strict upbringing. You know, the drinking, the partying, the women, the NASA women in bikinis, they were all taboo. But since joining the co-op program, he had been trying to reinvent himself, kind of aiming to be a little bit more exciting, more adventurous. And as everyone is chatting, he just blurts out, "Wow, it's a shame these parties only happen once a month. They should be weekly." And at that point, everyone has all eyes on him. And he loved it. He loved the attention. And he just kept going. He was like, we can even turn it into educational games, maybe a contest. At this point, he felt Brian just shoot him a look as if he was saying, stop it. But he didn't. That kept going. He's like, how about next week? We find the coolest thing we can do or get away with and then try to top it. And the person that picks out the most farthest out there story wins. He even went on to suggest a couple of ideas. He just kept going and going. All these ideas were fun, but they were definitely dangerous. After his big speech, everyone was like super pumped. They were like, yes, we should do that. We should do that. But Brian put them to the side. He's like, listen, don't do anything stupid, man. You don't need to impress anybody. And Thad was like, nah, I'm not trying to impress anybody. I'm just trying to have fun. Now, the thing about this, y'all, is my man Thad, he got himself in a tough spot. He wanted to reinvent himself, but he also signed up himself to do stuff that's pretty out there, things that can get him in trouble. But he couldn't back down. So what does he do? Well, he decides to take a stroll to building number 5. Now, y'all have to realize, because he had an interdisciplinary background, he does have access beyond the standard co-op. So he has access to other departments. Now, building number 5 housed the shuttle simulator, which is pretty darn off clearance for any newbies. He didn't have clearance for it, but he was like, let me give it a shot and see where I go. He walked to the black glass entrance. It had a huge metallic door, completely smooth, no knobs, buttons, or levers. There was only one single security camera pointing down at him. He kind of freaked out. He was about to bolt until somebody hears somebody's voice say, "Hey, can I help you?" He improvised. "I'm here for the shuttle simulator." Quickly, the door opened and just like let him on through. At this point, Thad is kind of freaking out internally, knowing that he's kind of doing something he probably shouldn't be doing. But at the same time, he doesn't really know how to navigate building number 5, given that at his level, he's not supposed to be there. So at one point, he just follows this individual with a white lab coat really close. And as the guy looks up, Thad's like, "Hi, can you point me towards the shuttle simulator?" Dude didn't even skip a beat. He's like, "Yeah, I'm going there right now." So Thad followed. They got into another metal door. The man held out his badge to the card reader, and then it opened right away. He screamed inside the door, and he's like, "Hey, this guy's here for the simulation run." A tactician walks in and pulls him aside. He's like, "All right, come on, let's go." At this point, he's being walked through a series of engineering panels, computer stations, whiteboards, a ton of black wires, and Thad is in complete awe of what he's seeing. The technician looks at him. He's like, "Your first time, huh?" Thad was a little bit nervous. He's still contemplating just ending it, running away and saying, "You know what? I'm done. I was just a joke. I'm not here for the shuttle simulator. I'm not even supposed to be here." A little bit of background on the shuttle simulator, right? It's held up by a crane and it can pivot in any direction for 90 degrees. So it can simulate things from takeoff to coming back, landing. For all intents and purposes, being in the simulator is the closest you can be to being in an actual space shuttle. Dad was strapped into the simulator cockpit. Again, it's a realistic simulation. In front of them, our screens are meant to mimic windows. It took him a while to strap himself in, and the pilot just turned back and was like, here, check off the checklist. And Dad wasn't really sure how to look at the checklist, but Dad is a little bit of an overachiever. He also got his pilot's license, so he was able to kind of check things off the checklist. At that point, the pilot said, fire it up. The entire cockpit began to shake. And at first it was a little bit low. Then we get to jerk him around a little harder. And all of a sudden he was propelled back into his seat. He was so happy, he just started screaming out of joy. He didn't even realize if anyone caught it, but it was so loud, I don't think anyone would have heard it. He found himself at the pool party and asked around, well, can anyone top that? And everyone was just really, really impressed. So after sneaking into Building 5, Thad began to build up a reputation for himself at NASA. He began to mingle with some of the Johnson Space Center elite, typically on Mondays for lunch at an Indian restaurant called the Kashmir Express. This wasn't like folks who are like mixing bottles and stuff. These are world famous geologists, physicists, astronomers, and engineers. All these folks have work out there. They're pretty well renowned. But the one individual that really stuck out across all of them was Everett Gibson. Everett Gibson was a reputable scientist in the life sciences space. He had a master's in physical chemistry, a PhD in geochemistry, and spent over 30 years at NASA. Gibson's lab was in building number 31. And what's really interesting about this building was during the start of the Apollo program, Building 31 acted as a receiving lab. So when specimens and rock samples came through, Gibson was a big part of processing those samples. Now, at the start of the Apollo program, no one really understood what the moon rocks contained, whether it had like alien pathogens, diseases, or if it'd be a risk to the world's population. Building 31 was built with high-tech quarantine technology for astronauts who spend weeks in chambers going through the multiple levels of purification, blood tests, and psychological evaluations. So a little bit more insight. The Apollo program collected about 842 pounds of moon rocks. And it gets even more, the way it's divided was interesting. Those 842 pounds of moon rocks were divided into 2,200 individual samples. Then they were subdivided even further to 110,000 studyable parts. With this many rocks, they needed their own building, which is Building 31 North. Now, this was completely separate from Gibson's lab, but it is NASA's most secure building. It is atmosphere controlled, has no wires, no pipes, no air ducts, but was strong enough to survive 1,000 years underwater without any water damage. So Thad and Everett Gibson began to evolve their relationship. They became more cordial. Again, Thad was cementing himself in the elite of the NASA program. Everett was part of that elite, and he formed a really good bond. One weekend, Sonia, Thad's wife, visited Thad at NASA, and he wanted to show her around. So as it happens, Gibson was giving a lecture, and Thad saw him, and it was like, oh, let me go introduce Sonia to Gibson. Thad asked for a favor. Would Gibson be open to showing Sonia some of the meteorite samples that he had shown previously? So he was like, sure, let's get a bite to eat and let's go to my lab. And then they went to Building 31. And as they approached Gibson's lab, he's a smart one. He began to notice stuff. He noticed that the door to the lab had a cipher lock, and that one that needs a pin to enter. But Gibson's lab was disengaged, a bit careless. Gibson stepped in. And while Sonia and Thad were waiting outside, Thad thought, let me take a peek. Wouldn't hurt anybody, right? So the lab for Gibson was about 16 by 20 feet. Gibson stopped in front of an upright steel safe. It had a wheel-style combination lock, and Gibson was leaning over the safe, reading a sheet of paper that was taped down. Thad thought, well, this is a little bit reckless if Gibson kept the combination on top of the safe like that. But after opening the safe, Gibson grabbed something from one of 5 drawers, and when he was finished, he joined Sonia and Thad back on the hallway. Gibson, all giddy, gave Sonia a vial. He explained that it had the lowest density meteorite ever found. And it was like, whoa, what a gift. Sonia asked, is it from the moon? Gibson said that moon rocks are too valuable to give away. For Gibson to get a hand on a moon rock himself, he'd have to think about an experiment, write a research proposal, have it peer-reviewed by non-NASA scientists. It was a whole thing. All the moon rocks that NASA had come from Apollo missions, and there aren't any more. And there weren't any intentions of going back to the moon to get any more. So for him to own a moon rock would be illegal. And any moon rock that he does have has been acquired over the last 30 years through research proposals, and they're all blocked away in the safe. Thad was super proud and happy that Gibson was kind enough to give them a meteorite. With that, Thad had a little bit more increased responsibility across NASA. There was a scientist, Dr. Andrea Cooper, stepped into his lab and was like, "You don't look like you're doing much." And he's like, "How about you want to work for me for a little bit at the lunar lab?" Thad jumped on the opportunity. And as they walked into the lunar lab, Cooper mentioned, it's like stepping into a submarine. There's a whole bunch of process that you have to go through, but it's pretty otherworldly. Similar to Gibson's lab, Cooper punched a number into the cipher lock, flashed her NASA ID to the camera, and got let in. They entered a small changing room with a bench in the middle, a couple of sinks and lockers. They put on their suits, a hairnet, wide surgical cap, and Cooper explained that afterwards, they have to enter a clean room. In the clean room, they have all the dust particles funneled out of their lungs through depressurization. Only then were they able to enter the lab. So what task did Cooper have for Thad? Well, Cooper mentioned that the lab itself contained 110,000 samples in a vault. The vault itself was pretty darn hefty. It had a 5-digit number, needed a code from a nearby tech. As Thad attempted to open the door, he struggled quite a bit. Cooper said that the vault itself was designed to withstand a pound of C4, so he's going to need to put his back into it. In it, Cooper explained that there were 110,000 samples. And they all ranged. They ranged from rocks and samples that are a couple of pounds to micron dust. Cooper pointed out a small door in the safe, and he said, "Those right there, those are return samples." Now, these samples, out of the 110,000 samples that exist out there, 2% of them are moon rocks that are pretty much junk. They're used, and they have no other purpose. That was like, how can you say that a moon rock from the moon is junk? He felt it was a little bit harsh to describe moon rocks samples that way. Thad did a quick bit of math. Early on, Everett Gibson mentioned that somebody had once tried to sell a gram of moon rock for $5 million. And Thad, kind of like a genius, he begins to crunch the numbers. Knowing that there are about 800 pounds of moon rocks at NASA and that someone tried to sell a gram of it for $5 million, Thad begins to calculate the 2%. The 2% that are seen as junk are worth $40 billion on the street. It's wild. This sits with Thad so much so that he just can't get over it. That evening, he couldn't even fall asleep because he kept thinking about the amount of value, the monetary value that exists within just the junk portion of all the moon rocks. But one evening, a couple of weeks after the event, he was back at the University of Utah. He was on the rooftop of the observatory for a star party. But this evening, it was a little bit odd. He wasn't feeling himself. He kind of felt that his relationship with Sonia was deteriorating. Now, Sonia herself, she runs in different social circles. She's a model. She was modeling, and her friends are also models. And every Wednesday, Sonia and her friends would go out downtown to a dance club. Not something Thad was really interested in. So he was a little gloomy. And at this point, at the star party, it was extremely cloudy. There weren't any stars. And no one was showing up. And it looked like it was about to rain. Then he heard somebody walk into the observatory roof. And not only did it plop down right next to him, they didn't acknowledge that. And he began to spark up a joint. And it wasn't that Thad did not approve of marijuana, but he thought it was a little bit ballsy to be on campus grounds and start sparking up. So he told the individual, "Listen, this week's session has been canceled." The individual was like, "No worries, just happy to look at clouds." The man and Thad began to talk. The guy's name is Gordon. He was a student at the university. He had taken some time off, but he's trying to finish up his studies. He was curious about some of the bigger concepts, the bigger questions out there, including the size of the universe, how many stars existed, and the possibility of life on other planets. Gordon was also very religious. He was a Mormon, so they had that in common. Another thing important to call out about Gordon was that he had a bit of a criminal past. It didn't say what it was, but he did engage in some illegal activities. After a little while, it began to rain, and Thad decided, let's call it a night. After that night, Thad began to spot Gordon across the campus here and there. Because he's so keen on capitalizing on the moon rocks he just learned about, He approaches Gordon and is like, hey, listen, I have something valuable, but I need to find the right buyer, possibly on the internet. Can you help me out? And Gordon was like, well, depends what you're trying to sell. Thad comes out right out with it. And he's like, it's moon rocks. At first, Gordon wasn't really sure. Like, was it from a museum, a private collection? Thad didn't want to explain it, but he gave Gordon some homework. He was like, all right, well, give me a little bit and I'll see what I can come up with. 2 weeks later, Gordon emails Thad an update. In the email, Gordon copied and pasted the emails of 7 addresses, people he reached out to or got a response from. He began to use an alias because when you're doing something illegal, of course, you don't want to be traced back to you. You don't want to use your real name. So he began to call himself Orb Robinson. So Orb Robinson, a.k.a. Thad, began to pitch and sell the moon rocks to various organizations. One of those organizations was in Belgium called the Antwerp Mineral Club. Enter Axel Emmerman. Axel was the founder of the club. He received an email from Orb Robinson, and he thought it was a little bit suspect. Instead of throwing it away or deleting it, he wanted to play along. He wanted to get to the bottom of who this Orb Robinson was and whether or not he did have moon rocks. But Axel isn't dumb. It sounds silly. For me, it might sound silly, like, oh, a mineral club. But these guys are legit about minerals. Like, it's insane. So a little bit of background on the Antwerp Mineral Club. Axel founded it when he was 16 years old. He recruited reputable professors that have actual minerals named after them. And he's wholly aware of how illegal it is to own moon rocks. So with that, he takes the communication and everything he knows about Orb Robinson and other emails, and he forwards it on to the FBI. So as he's waiting for a response from the FBI, Thad or Orb Robinson gets a little bit ballsy, gets a little anxious. He, instead of talking about just individual rocks, he begins to talk about them in grams. Then he goes on to carats, and then he goes on to kilograms. So he's thinking, oh my God, if this individual, Orb Robinson, is talking about selling moon rocks in kilograms, how many rocks does he actually have? If Orb was hoaxing, he'd either be trying to fraud somebody out of a lot of money, or if he was real, he had stolen a lot of moon rocks, both of which are highly illegal. After a few days, the FBI replied back to Axel's email. Orb Robinson begins to share a little bit more information. He mentions that it's a time-sensitive matter as he has to acquire the rocks. He also states that he and his group only want fair prices. And Axel, again, he's playing sleuth, but he's pretty smart about it. Axel begins to gather that Orb, he's basically giving himself away for a crime that hasn't yet happened. Briefly, Axel's kind of torn, like, should I actually help implicate this individual, given that he hasn't done anything yet, or should I go along with it? Regardless, they go along with it. Axel is in Belgium, but they need support from U.S. counterparts. So the FBI agent begins to loop in another female agent who will pose as Axel's sister, who lives in the U.S., and they create a whole dummy email address around her and begin to loop her into the conversation with Orb Robinson, aka Thad. Orb states that he's willing to coordinate with the sister on a purchase of $100,000 worth of moon rocks. Now you can see that is kind of burning himself a little bit deeper and deeper in the prospect of illegally acquiring and selling moon rocks. And it's funny because, like, you begin to get a taste of what Thad is thinking. A part of it, he's trying to justify it to himself. He's saying, like, well, it's considered junk, so what does it matter? The NASA doesn't care about them. They're gonna go to waste. So as all this business with the moon rocks are going on, it's important to state that Thad continues to be a thriving member at NASA and a mentor for incoming co-ops. Thad is ingraining himself at NASA. He's being able to use what's called an EMU, an extravehicular mobility unit, which is meant to simulate weightlessness in space. It also houses the biggest pool in the world. The EMU is a replicate of actual shuttle bays in outer space. So he's getting a little bit more trust, which is awesome. NASA's actually handed off a little bit more, like, they're loosening the reins and giving Thad a little bit more responsibility and freedom over there at NASA. I also highlight this because at this point it's important to note that with all the investment of time and energy that NASA is making into Thad, it's a really strong likelihood, or it's a possibility, that Thad might be a prospect for future space programs. Something to keep in mind. In the meantime, He hosts some regular outings. It's pretty cool to new co-ops that kind of give them a chance to mingle and get out of their comfort zones. The excursions, they vary from hiking, skydiving, and scuba diving. And during these events, he meets two very important people. Sandra. She's a girl trying to get out of her comfort zone and experience new things. She immediately becomes friends with Thad after they go skinny dipping. Yeah, skinny dipping. Now, Rebecca. Rebecca is a co-op that Thad met during a cliff dive. Right off the bat, they hit it off. He falls head over heels for Rebecca almost immediately. They go on a date a short time later, and then after the date, they get bizarre. So at this point, Sonia, Rebecca was all that mattered. Also, a really cool thing to note is that throughout the book, there are love notes across various chapters. I didn't realize it, but there were all love notes that are presumably to Rebecca. So eventually, Thad wants to bring Sandra and Rebecca in the know about his idea to steal moon rocks. You see, Thad was acting a little bit weird, and they tried to figure out what was up. It's not that he caved, but he kind of got chumped out with Sandra. She's apparently super smart, and he lost to like a really smart game to her, and they bet whether or not he would tell her. Rebecca, they'd be hugging each other, and Rebecca would look at his eyes, and he'd just go off in the distance, begin to think about something else, get distracted, I guess. And she called him out on it. She's like, listen, what's going on? And to both of them, he admitted what he was trying to do. He was trying to steal moon rocks. They were both very accepting, and Rebecca even encouraged it. She was like, whatever you want, babe. So she was happy to do it with him. So eventually, the FBI began to coordinate on a time and a date for the sale of the moon rocks. Axel's sister, who was the FBI agent in disguise, Lynn, was going to pick up the moon rocks with her husband, Kurt. During this whole thing, the FBI actually asks Axel specifically to help testify against Orb later on. Now, as the FBI is asking Axel additional questions on some of the moon rocks, it occurs to Axel that, oh wow, the FBI don't really know how to recognize real moon rocks. The thing is, the FBI aren't necessarily lunar mineral specialists. And if they wanted lunar mineral specialists, they would go to NASA. But the FBI can't do that because they're speculating kind of what Axel speculated too, where whoever Orb is, they have a connection with NASA and they're trying to steal from NASA. They don't want to kind of expose the theft or the sale of the moon rocks. At this point, we have Thad well underway with the heist. And the way Thad breaks it up, there's 3 phases to the heist. Phase 1 is preparation for the heist. So he could have gone to the lunar lab that housed 110,000 lunar samples, but the security on that was just top notch. It was not going to happen. So he noted that Everett Gibson's lab was a little less secure. So he decided to target that. To do that, he had to avoid various cameras. So there are an endless amount of cameras on the NASA compound. He had to time them out when they turn and which direction they turn so he can hide behind corners. And he had found himself kind of hiding, counting as the cameras rotated. He had to figure out a way to get into his lab using a keypad. So Thad concocted this type of powder. So this powder, when viewed under a special flashlight, it would bright up. But because it would be tapped on during a keypad sequence, the powder would begin to decrease in brightness after each subsequent press, indicating the code for the lock. Pretty smart. The entire time, Thad is like thinking to himself, Mission Impossible melody. Dun, 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 dun. I think that's the melody. Phase 2, getting a getaway car while coordinating the sale. So during this time, Thad and Gordon are doing research on the buyer's sister, Lynn, and finalizing details. They're meeting in Florida. But Thad also has to think through, how am I going to get onto the NASA compound? Basically what they do is when someone enters the parking lot, security looks at the sticker on their dashboard and they're like, all right, you're a NASA-approved vehicle, go on in. But he didn't want to give away his getaway car, his license plate and all that information. So what he does is he borrows a NASA-approved getaway car, a Jeep Grand Cherokee from his buddy named Chip, who is not involved. Then he goes over to a strip mall. He switches out the license plates with another car to cover their tracks. Then phase 3, setting up his lab. So phase 3 basically consists of booking a hotel room and making it into a makeshift lab. This involves moving the bed, TV, furniture, laying out a tarp, and bringing in a whole bunch of tools to open Gibson's safe. And then it's game day, y'all. The heist takes place on a rainy day. Originally, it was supposed to happen on a Sunday, but everyone was ready on a Saturday, and they were like, let's just do it Saturday. So Thad, Rebecca, and Jessica all go to NASA. And there was an alibi. Just in case they got found out, there was an alibi. Because everyone's going to find out that a whole bunch of moon rocks are missing. The alibi was that they were on an excursion with students, but they stepped away for a little bit. They got past the guards fairly quickly. Because it was raining, the guards didn't want to come out and investigate the vehicle, who was in it, the license plates. They looked at the sticker for parking for NASA, and they were like, go on through. They used an old acquaintance's code to get into Building 31, where the moon rocks were stored. It was Thad and Rebecca who entered. Jessica decided to stay behind. They brushed off the keypad, which unveiled the code sequence, and they entered into Gibson's lab. Entering into Gibson's lab, Thad wanted to focus on the paper that's sitting on top of his safe. He assumed that the paper itself would house the combination. But every sequence he tried to do, every combination, wasn't working, and he was like, holy crap. Plan B, we have to lug this safe back with us. So him, Jessica, and Rebecca find themselves putting was it 5 or 100 pound safe on top of a dolly and just wheeling it out of NASA. At the hotel room, it was surprisingly easy to open the safe. I think they drilled 2 or 3 times into it, and they were like, holy crap, this thing is made of aluminum. And with it, they wanted to be very careful. They also wanted to be very respectful of what the contents of the safe were. I mean, after all, they were scientists. They had a notepad and a pen, and they began to catalog each individual rock, what was in it, and they intended to return everything they weren't going to sell. However, Thad, he decided he wanted to keep a couple things. Thad found a lunar sample collected by Neil Armstrong, as well as a fragment recovered from Antarctica. Now, this fragment was believed to be from Mars, and he's like, I'm taking this. Now, all in all, on all the grams that they collected, they calculated the street value of it at over $500 million. They call it a day. After that, they go to a Denny's, I think, to have breakfast. They're dead tired, and they know they have to go back to excursion, but they were like, let's reward ourselves. It took a couple of days for the news of the robbery to break out at NASA. And almost immediately, Rebecca starts crying. She's like, I can't do this. This is too much. This is too much pressure. But she's the one that's holding all the moon rocks at her place. So rightfully so, she begins to freak out. Thad tries to calm her down, like it's almost going to be over, a couple of more days. We're at the home stretch. So as they prepare for the sale of the moon rocks, Rebecca and Thad both make a drive to Florida. Gordon states that he's going to join them there. But during the entire car ride, they're talking about, again, what it means to have these moon rocks, like $100,000 worth of moon rocks. And it's funny, again, Thad, he tries to justify it to himself, like, these are going to go to waste if we don't do something with these used moon rocks. We can change our entire lives. We can pay off credit card debt, student loan debt. We can take vacations together. We can start a life together with the money that we make. As they get to their hotel room, Gordon arrives. Now, at this point, I thought it was pretty neat what they did with Gordon's perspective. So you all know, Gordon is highly inebriated. He's like high off of probably a few things. He was getting 10% of $100,000. And even before getting to the hotel room, he's like, what am I going to do with that 10%? I can really do stuff with that 10%. I can go to Europe. I can do more drugs. Might OD, but it'd be a trip. Then the moment that Thad and Rebecca show him that, hey, you know what? Here are the moon rocks. He freezes up. He's like, oh my gosh, this is actually real. This is actually going to happen. We have moon rocks that are more than likely robbed from probably NASA. His insight was, this is going to end badly. We're all going to get caught. Rebecca, Thad, and myself. But he went along with it. You know, he's like, I'm in on a journey, so let's do it. So he leaves the hotel room, leaves Thad and Rebecca alone while he goes on to probably do other stuff. And at that moment, y'all, this is where we get the title. Sex on the Moon. Before the meeting in the hotel room, Thad places a few grams of moon rock underneath the bed sheets and blast off, y'all. Blast off. That's as much as it took, you know, like the entire book kind of ramped up to this one, like small chapter, and we moved on. So, after this, the plan was for Thad to meet up Lynn and her husband at the restaurant, while Rebecca and Gordon were out the hotel waiting. The goal was to leave the samples at the hotel, have Rebecca and Gordon come meet them. I think it's a security measure. but Thad was going to meet Lynn and her husband firsthand by himself. So during the meeting, they arrive at the restaurant. Thad spots Lynn, and he begins to notice, like, oh, she's a little bit nervous, but her husband's way more serious. He begins to get comfortable with the couple, starts talking. They get a booth. They start talking and sharing. And at this point, Thad is sharing way too much information. He's stating that his two friends are waiting for him, that they can make a movie out of the stuff that he's done, and then he hopes they're not wearing wires. All right, y'all. I'm not a criminal mastermind, but I would imagine this is not how you behave during like a really big heist. At that point, Rebecca and Gordon walk in, and it's evident that Gordon is even more high than when he was in the hotel room. Not only that, but he continues drinking at the restaurant bar. Both Thad and Rebecca just keep oversharing, y'all. Thad shares that there's a vial of supposed microfossils from Mars that he's more than happy to show Lynn, her husband. Rebecca shares that she's a bioengineering major and how they know each other. Gordon is rambling about how he found Axel through a website. And they just keep going on and on, y'all. At that point, they were like, you know what? Let's get going, right? Let's just wrap it all up. Let's finish up this deal. So as Thad is getting up to head out the door, he really gets a quick glance at everyone in the restaurant. And he notices that everyone is middle-aged. There aren't any kids, and there aren't any families or teenagers. They get to Lynn's car as they make their way to the hotel where the moon rock samples are being held. Lynn was kind enough to open the door, and as Thad gazes up to thank her, he notices that Lynn wasn't looking right at him, that she was looking off in the distance. And Thad turns his head to follow her gaze. He notices that Lynn is looking at a couple across the parking lot getting into their car. So as Thad's sitting there driving to the hotel, he begins to think about like what he's going to do with the $110,000. And immediately he feels the harsh slamming of Lynn's brakes. And he's plowed forward. And then all of a sudden, dozens of men with guns start racing to the car, pointing them at Thad. They pull him out and they slam him onto the ground. And right away, Thad knew what was happening. He knew he messed up really bad. At that point, he's like, just shoot me. Just shoot me because this is not going to go well. On the ground, though, he noticed that Rebecca, because remember, Rebecca and Gordon were following them too. They pull Rebecca and Gordon out of their cars and they both get shoved into the ground as well. So he begins to say like, you know what? Whatever happens, I can't let anything happen to Rebecca. And it's funny because he's only known Rebecca for like 10 days. So I don't know. This kind of love, y'all. So I know I'm running a little bit long, y'all. So I'm going to make this quick. So Thad does get sentenced. At first, his lawyer thinks that, okay, it shouldn't be that bad. I mean, you didn't harm anybody. You stole moon rocks, but he got sentenced 8.3 years in prison. The reason why he got sentenced so much was because the judge applied what's called a 5K 2.7 enhancement, which is typically reserved for acts of terrorism. It's reserved for individuals who actually bring down or shut down a branch of the U.S. government. So it's pretty hefty. He's being charged kind of like a terrorist. On top of that, what sealed the deal for him in the 8.3 years was Dr. Gibson, Everett Gibson, the gentleman that was taking a shine to Thad. He had this heart-wrenching testimony where he explained that there were books that had his scientific work which were priceless in the safe that had been stolen, but they were lost. It was his life's work and it was all gone. And it was Thad's fault. Despite a plea from Thad, the judge quickly decided, you know what, you're getting 100 months. That's it. Well, I'm going to put a pin in it for here, folks, as I'm running a little bit long. Buy the book if you want to hear more about what happens after his arrest, assimilating to prison, his relationship with Rebecca behind bars. Overall, I had a really fun time reading this book and making this podcast. I really hope you enjoyed Sex on the Moon. If you're interested, I've linked the book in the show notes. If you enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. With that, thank you for stopping by, and until the next one, take care.